I'm just going to give a few seconds for the participants to come in from the waiting room. Okay, we can give it a start. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. My name is Mihai. Chihaia. I'm a policy analyst for the European Policy Center, and it's my pleasure to moderate this policy dialogue entitled Greening EU-Mediterranean Relations, Synergies and Cooperation Opportunities. Firstly, before we move into the introduction, I'll just shoot out a thank you note to the European Investment Bank for helping us put together this event. And the topic today, of course, is the green transition, and with emphasis on the energy transition, green energy transition in the Mediterranean. Of course, there are many things to touch upon, but maybe I'll just point out some obvious things, such as the Mediterranean region is very vulnerable to climate change. It's facing severe challenges such as extreme heat, water scarcity, and reduced rainfall. And at the same time, there are also a high potential for renewable energy development. But for all of this, it needs investments and cooperation with like-minded actors. And here, of course, Europe and the Southern Neighbourhood have converging interests, and there is a variety of cooperation opportunities. At the same time, the energy transition also brings different risks and tensions, such as technological competition, supply chain risks, or different digital threats. Of course, besides this, there are also two important moments that are affecting the energy transition in the Mediterranean, which is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and now the recovery process, and, of course, the war in Ukraine, which has changed the whole environment, not only from a security defense perspective, but also through other lenses, such as food security, energy security, and cooperation. So I think there are quite a few important key questions that need to be addressed, such as what are the current trends of energy transition in the Mediterranean region? What are the current challenges? What are the solutions to these challenges? How can Europe and Southern Neighbourhood cooperation be enhanced? What role do different institutions and organizations play? Of course, how is the COVID-19 recovery process influencing the energy transition in the Southern Neighbourhood? And last but not least, what are the implications of the war in Ukraine? Thankfully, I don't have to answer these questions. That's why we have a wonderful panel with us today. I'm just briefly going to introduce the speakers. We have with us today Lionel Rapaille, who is Director for Neighbouring Countries at the European Investment Bank. We have Stefano Dotto from DJ NEAR, he's Head of Sector there. And then we have Ines Duarte from the Union for Mediterranean. She's also Head of Sector there at Energy and Climate Action Division. And last but not least, we have Intissar Fakir from the Middle East Institute. She is Director of the North Africa and Sahel program there. Before we go into discussion, a few housekeeping rules. In order to ask questions, you have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can just type your question there and I'll direct it to the speakers. I'll read it out loud, or you can just hit the raise your hand button and my colleagues will unmute you, will give you the floor and you can ask your question directly. Now we're going to start with a few opening remarks from each of the speakers, and then I'll follow up with some questions. We'll forge a debate, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A with the audience. And without further ado, I'll just give the floor to Director Rapaille for a few opening questions. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and well, thank you very much to the European Policy Center for organizing this event. I think it is essential that we keep the green transition, climate action high on the agenda. So we are very pleased from the IB perspective to participate to this discussion. To start with, perhaps a few considerations on the impact of climate change on the Med region. I mean, you said it, the Mediterranean region is recognized for degradation. And I would say that in this region than elsewhere. I just took a look at the last IPCC report, just released beginning of April, and the numbers are striking. The number of hot days will increase by up to 90% by the end of the century. The children born in 2020 will be exposed 4 to 6 times more heat waves than, let's say, children born in the 60s. There will be 4 months instead of 2 months of drought in the next few decades. So this is really, really very, very impressive. The region is vulnerable to the impact of the sea level rise because of dense human settlements close to the shores. And as you mentioned, resource scarcity is already tangible, especially water stressed. So we have all these factors combined, which lead to issues of desertification, health issues, food insecurity, to adapt to this climate change. And how they tackle climate change? Well, actually, on the energy side, we could see a marked increase in energy consumption. The generation capacity in the region has more than tripled over the last 20 years, which is very impressive. But still, there is lots of energy production based on, let's say, fossil fuel. It's a high carbon, let's say, energy. Whereas it is widely recognized that the region has strong potentials on low carbon energy with renewables. So of course, there is a big need to increase the share of renewables in the total energy consumption of the region. I see that most countries, if not all in the region, are really taking strong steps in this direction. So we see a number of governments of Eastern and Southern Mediterranean regions putting in place climate change plans. So in Morocco, for instance, the government announced end of October a target of 50% in energy mix in renewables by 2030. Egypt has announced a number of projects and will, of course, highlight this in the context of the COP27 taking place later this year in Sharm el-Sheikh. Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia have also announced a number of programs targeting climate action. Now, from an EU perspective, well, there are ambitious policies both in the Union and beyond borders. And when the European Green Deal was announced in December 2019, it was very clear that an emphasis on supporting the neighbors in the efforts on climate action was needed. And I can really see the green transition being, let's say, at the core of the economic diplomatic relations of EU across the Mediterranean. I'm sure that our colleagues from the European Commission will go into more details on the agenda for the Mediterranean and the economic and investment plan, which have a number of project activities targeting the green transition. And of course, from the EU bank perspective, well, we are very pleased to contribute as much as possible to these efforts. Now, how will EIB support the green transition? We have our vision and our strategy on climate enshrined in what we call our climate bank roadmap, where basically the EIB group announced that we will support 1 trillion of investment in climate action by 2030. We will progressively increase our share of financing dedicated to climate and environmental sustainability to 50% by 2025. And of course, this applies both inside the EU and outside the EU. In the Med region, we have approximately 30% of our investments, which are, let's say, focusing on climate change adaptation and mitigation. We have supported over the last 10 years more than 2 billion euros of projects in the energy sector. To give a couple of examples, we supported the Noor Ouarzazate solar energy complex in Morocco with more than 200 million euro of financing in a coordinated effort with the EU and other international partners. But at another scale, for instance, in Palestine, we supported a project to install photovoltaic systems on 500 public schools in the West Bank. No, our intention is clearly to scale up our investment in climate action and the green energy transition, and to mobilize a whole spectrum of instruments, because it's not clearly a one-size-fits-all solution which is suitable. So we need to go from public sector lending to corporate, private sector investment and crowd in, let's say, private investment. we need to focus on equity, microfinance investment, as well as public-private partnership. And this we can do under the new NDC Global Europe mandate, which is being let's say rolled out by having EU guarantees backing our support and to provide as well instruments, notably de-risking instruments for investments. We intend to mobilize as well lots of technical expertise, technical assistance, as it is key to establish and launch large projects. Now, it is important, I believe, to focus on large-scale projects which require financing on attractive terms and project expertise. So, of course, renewable energy, invest in the electricity grid to accommodate the renewable energy project, in storage, invest more in interconnection projects to enable, let's say, the countries to have more flows, electricity flows. We will look at hydrogen projects. The countries in the region can capitalize on green and blue hydrogen as elements of the decarbonization strategy. And the EU actually sees the development of hydrogen as key to reach the objective of carbon neutrality. So EIB will put its experience in the field of hydrogen into specific projects, which we are looking at. So large-scale projects, but it is important in parallel to focus on what I would call, let's say, a more decentralized approach, smaller scale projects. So here we see lots of potential to support small, medium enterprises, which can sometimes perform better and in the, let's say, less supported areas. So we really need to rethink the approach on, I would say, greening the economy as a whole. So we will as well continue rolling out program to support green investment by SMEs and to green the financing systems, so working with commercial banks, central banks, notably to issue green bonds. So really, I think time is of the essence, and it's important to target the whole spectrum of needs for the climate transition. Perhaps a few additional considerations from my side. It is important to consider the climate transition in all sectoral strategies. Energy, of course, but as well mobility, water, agriculture, industrial production, and as well to consider both the mitigation, but equally important because climate is changing, to invest in climate adaptation. And I just will give an example of a project which we intend to support in Jordan. We recently committed 250 million euros for a desalination project to bring water from the Red Sea to Amman. But we intend to implement measures to increase the efficiency of water resources in Amman in the Jordan Valley. And as well, we intend to use renewable energy resources to implement such projects. So I think it's important to have, let's say, an holistic approach. And last point I would like to mention is the importance, of course, to consider the green transition with an inclusive approach, so that these changes are enabled to mobilize all strata of the society and to create employment in this context. So, like the European Just Transition Mechanism, it is essential to put in place tools that can ensure the transition to climate neutral economy for the entire, let's say, societies of the regions. So we will actively contribute from the EIB perspective to the green transition. We have now all instruments coming in place with the new mandate under NDC Global Europe. So we'll work with partners, first and foremost with the European Commission, to roll out this support. And I think, of course, in the context of COP27 in Egypt, we intend to showcase how we can move from, let's say, commitment to implementation, which is now critical. So thank you very much again for this discussion.
Thank you very much for setting the scene a little bit. I think there are also some connections issues, so we couldn't see you at some point, but we could hear you very well. So thank you for just setting the scene, also for mentioning a bit the perspective, you know, from the local countries, from the region. We'll come back to that once we get to Intissar. Then you also mentioned a little bit about what IEB is doing, and here maybe I would just have a follow-up question, if I may, and it is, what are the challenges the IEB faces in cooperation with Southern Neighbourhood countries?
Thank you for your question. Well, actually, I mean, the IB has been investing for more than 4 decades now in the region. So I think we have developed a very good, strong understanding and network with the partners. And we are, of course, engaged in constant dialogue between the EU and the partner countries. I think the new agenda for the Mediterranean, the economic and investment plan, constitute a clear roadmap for us to intervene. And as I just mentioned, there are a number of projects targeting climate. Now, of course, there are challenges. One is that, well, the region has experienced economic and political challenges in the last 2 decades. Now, with the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, it has consequences, of course, on budget, and there are budget constraints which needs to be taken into account. I think what is important for us is to continue enhancing the technical capacities of the partners on the ground, and to have a dialogue to ensure adequate governance, so more buy-in, more coordination perhaps around the stakeholders, as well as better coordination on international support. On this last point, perhaps, we have this principle of Team Europe, which is now being implemented. And I think this is a very great approach to ensure that we focus on priority areas, priority projects.
Thank you for that. Now, let's just move on to Stefano to hear the perspective from the European Commission. Stefano, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mihai, and thank you very much to the SEPs for giving me the opportunity to speak before such a selected and prestigious audience. I'll give you an overview of what in DGNIR we see as fields of cooperation and the tools that we are using for this. First of all, consider that cooperation with Mediterranean countries is framed by the neighborhood policy, which is neither preparation for accession nor the usual assistance to development that we give to third countries. It's more funded on a partnership concept. And then the Green Deal, of course, you have already heard, everybody has heard about the Green Deal, which is the way the EU will support the sustainable growth and achieve the sustainable development goals. But of course, the sustainable development goals are global objectives. The EU alone cannot achieve them alone. Not only if it's not a concerted action, the action of the EU alone will not serve to anything. That's why a concerted action is absolutely necessary. We have spelled out our priorities for cooperation in the neighborhood south, so the southern rim of the Mediterranean, in the document that published last year, which is the joint communication between the Commission and the External Action Service, the renewed partnership with the Southern Neighbourhood. And the subtitle is a new agenda for the Mediterranean. This agenda aims at a green, digital and resilience and just recovery after the COVID crisis. So it's mostly a recovery agenda, and it's guided by the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, the Paris Agreement, and of course the Green Deal that I just mentioned, and everybody knows, of course. And this communication proposes a number of cooperation areas, and as well as an investment plan for the southern neighbors, as Director Rapaille just mentioned. 3 more horizontal and more, how can I say, human-driven issues are human development, governance, and rule of law, peace and security, and migration and mobility. And then we have 2 more technical themes of cooperation, which are closer to the subject that we're discussing now, which are to strengthen resilience and digital transition, and joining forces to fight climate change, decrease harmful emissions, use of resources, sustainability, and speed up the green transition. And under this last heading, we included support countries in meeting their climate commitment, basically the SDGs, and strengthen their ambition. So not only respecting the actual SDGs, but increasing them, and drive the energy transition and ensure their energy security. Also, other objectives are encouraging energy resource efficiency. And in resources, we include, of course, energy, water, waste, and the protection of marine biodiversity and fight the pollution. And then also very important is how can we face the challenge of ensuring food sustainability, food security for the region. So in broad sense, how are we going to implement the Green Deal through a legislative agenda? So the Fit for 55, I'm not going to go in detail of this because it's a plan for the EU, but I'm mentioning it because elements in the Fit for 55 may be of inspiration for third countries. We will promote a sustainable finance and international cooperation on this topic. And in particular, we have set up the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which I'm also mentioning because, for instance, is open to third parties, and Morocco is part of the IPFS. We design strategies such as Circular Economy Action Plan, the Adaptation Strategy, Plastic Strategy, Farm to Fork. You probably heard of these. And some of these strategies, and those in particular that I mentioned, do have an external dimension that guide our action abroad. Then, of course, we have policy cooperation and technical assistance. And we have also diplomacy tools, for instance, water diplomacy, climate diplomacy, and the latest conclusions of the Council on climate diplomacy recall the importance of implementing the COP26, and we are on the way to COP27, of course, in Sharm. We also have green partnerships that we establish with countries that complement the existing sectoral dialogue and cooperation on certain specific themes that are addressed to countries which are sufficiently advanced to reach a level of meaningful cooperation, but do not necessarily have a clear commitment towards climate neutrality. And these partnerships include tools that span from reinforced platforms of policy dialogue, support to reforms linked to the green transition, technical and financial assistance, investment, trade incentives, market access, etc. Now, all these tools, how do they work in particular in the Med region? First of all, policy cooperation. The EU is co-chair of the Union for the Mediterranean. We have a distinguished representative of the UFM here in the person of Ines. And as co-chair, of course, our role is to steer the discussions at technical level, so in the technical working groups of the UFM, and at more political level in the negotiations and the establishment of the ministerial declarations which constitute the political commitments that ministers take in the ministerial conferences. And last year we had two major conferences that are interest for this discussion. It's of course the one that was held in Cairo on environment and climate action, and the one on energy. I mentioned partnership. We have a green partnership with Morocco, which will support the objectives and the tools that I mentioned before. And we expect that this partnership will contribute to Morocco efforts in achieving its SDGs and its environmental objectives, and in decarbonizing its economy. Then we also have the technical cooperation volet, which is I would say the most visible aspect of our action, and it's the projects. The projects can be bilateral or regional. When you have a bilateral project, in the context of bilateral cooperation, the countries and the Commission negotiate 3 areas of intervention, and we stick to these. On regional projects, It's a bit different. It's the regional projects are designed by the Commission. They're open to all participants, but they're not specifically negotiate with each country. They're open to each country. The stakeholders in the countries can participate, and of course the central authorities have to be involved and have to agree. But I would say it goes a bit the other way, and they are based on the EU agenda, the EUFM agendas, which, because of the fact of clearly the fact that EU is co-presidency, they often coincide, and of course the Green Deal, the SDGs, etc. Among the themes that have an obvious regional dimension, we clearly have cooperation on energy, integration of energy markets, improvement of energy grids. We have climate action, we have environment, transport, connectivity, and then a number of other pretty issues. But these ones are the ones that address more particularly the topic that we're discussing now. Now, among the projects that we have in place, sustainability is not only about energy, of course, it's about efficient use of resources. For this, we have been having for several years the project SwitchMed, which is a project promoting resource efficient economy and circular economy, which is implemented by UNIDO and has already been scaled up in 3 countries in the region. One thing of regional projects is that there's often of a smaller scale, but they allow us also to test things. And the obvious example of a project that has been scaled up is precisely SwitchMed. Another one is what we call Climatry Cities. It was a call for proposal which followed the fact that for many, many years, the Commission has been funding sustainable energy and environment action plans by local authorities. But then the implementation of these was a bit below our expectations. So we tried something different. Instead of funding 80, 90, 100% of the investment that would be needed, we proposed to the municipalities, to the local authorities, sorry, to be more precise, to fund maximum 50%. And then on the base of this, they were invited to find the remaining 50% of the funding. So we have signed 6 projects, they're starting now. And we will be able to present the lessons that we've learned, hopefully at the COP 27. The idea was precisely to see how local authorities can make use of sophisticated financial instruments, of climate finance, and how they can involve the local stakeholders, civil society, NGOs, universities, etc. Another important project relevant for discussions and energy efficiency is the...
Sorry, Stefano, we're going a bit over time, so maybe you can just quickly wrap up in 1 minute and then we'll come back to you on another round.
Okay, then I will not...
But that's okay.
Perfect, sorry for... it happens when you're passionate about what you're doing. Yeah, so challenges for the future, it appeared that sustainability is not such a big concern of local populations and businesses, so we have to raise the interest for sustainability in the region. We have to streamline climate action and environment action, knowing that the Commission is committed to spending 35% of external assistance on climate. Then the next big thing is the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We will further scale up SwitchMed and reorient it in a way to be more impactful. We will continue investing on biodiversity. And as regards climate action, Director Rapaille mentioned correctly the fact that the countries have an issue with adaptation needs, where they are relatively small emitters of greenhouse gas emissions compared to the impact that climate action is having on them. Then food security is a key issue on which we are finding means to intervene and that we're studying at the moment. Digitalization, the rate of digitalization in the country is insufficient. And then how are we going to address the current energy crisis and to work with our Southern neighborhood to improve both sides' energy security, including, and this may go through major investments in gas and in the hydrogen, and in particular green hydrogen. Okay, I'll stop here. Of course, I'm sorry if I went beyond the time allocated. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. I'll maybe just move on with the other speakers, and then we'll come back to you with a few questions, because I'm mindful also about the time. We have until 5:30, so I just want to go to all the speakers and then come back with more questions, and also to give enough time to go through the Q&A with the audience. So Ines, you have the floor from the perspective from the Union for Mediterranean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mihai, and thank you, Stefano, as well, for making a brief presentation of the role of the UFM and the role of the Commission as a co-president of the UFM. So please allow me to contextualize a bit what is the Union for the Mediterranean, because it's not as well known as the Commission or the IB. So the Union for the Mediterranean is an intergovernmental organization based in Barcelona. It's the first permanent structure dedicated to the Mediterranean Partnership. Obviously it promotes cooperation in the region. It also promotes projects, but in partnership with IFIs like the IB, for example, given that we are not a bank, we don't finance projects. And as an institution, it brings together 42 countries from the region. So all of the EU countries plus 15 countries in the Southern Neighbourhood that get together at the table of negotiations at ministerial level to discuss numerous topics, some of them in this case in terms of energy or climate. Our governance, as I mentioned, is a co-presidency. So on one hand, we have the EU that represents the Northern Shore, and representing the countries from the Southern Shore, we have Jordan. So in a sense, this design ensures a co-ownership of all the decision-making that is made in collaboration with both shores on an equal footing as well. Our mandate to work on these topics basically stem from ministerial declarations, namely, as Stefano mentioned, last year we had 2 ministerial declarations, one on energy and one on climate action, that basically give us the remit for the Secretariat to work on these topics. In addition, obviously, given that the EU is our co-presidency, we also follow EU policies closely, obviously in dialogue with other countries, but we follow closely the European neighborhood policy and also the new agenda for the Mediterranean. So they are important policy tools to inform our action. In terms of deep diving now into the topic, I would like to say that I'm going to focus mostly on 5 points. So it would be, for me, for us, the important points would be on this topic from the UFM perspective are the science policy nexus, the diversity of the region, the net zero targets in the region, the energy transition, and also the financing needs. So regarding the science policy nexus, this is a topic that the UFM takes very seriously. And we know that the Mediterranean is a climate hotspot that also overlaps with a fragility hotspot. What we are doing in terms of bridging the science policy network is that we are supporting a network of experts, so basically scientists that work on these topics. We've helped to set up a network called MEDEX, so it's called Mediterranean Experts on Climate and Environment Change. And this is an independent scientific network over 700 scientists from 35 countries that work to produce independent assessment reports targeted to the region. Obviously, most of these scientists also work for the IPCC reports, but the difference is that the IPCC reports are very broad and they don't treat the Mediterranean region as a whole. So the Mediterranean region in the UN framework system doesn't exist as a region. So we thought that it was important to create this network just to focus on the problematic of the Mediterranean. And we know, as our fellow speakers have already mentioned, we know that it's a climate hotspot, that the average temperature in the Mediterranean has increased already by 1.5 degrees, and that is warming 20% faster than the global average. We know that this has serious implications for the Mediterranean population that is also projected to grow exponentially. On the other hand, we have issues like, for example, the sea level rise. For example, we know that it's expected to rise by 20 centimeters by 2050. And this may not seem like a lot, a big figure, but it is enough to basically salinize the delta of the Nile, just to give you an example, which has a population of up to 250 million inhabitants. So it's serious and it has concrete impact on our population. Obviously, we also follow the IPCC assessment reports, namely the one that had a chapter on the Mediterranean region. And as mentioned, the usual suspects are the temperature increase, droughts will be more frequent and intense, the sea level rise, as I mentioned. So all of that gives us the science fundamentals to inform our ministries of the different countries from the UFM to take action. So that's why we are working with, namely with the MEDEC network. Secondly, as I mentioned, this is a very diverse region in terms of regional integration. If we have on the one hand the North Shore, it's very integrated with regards to the EU, with the common market. But if we take, for example, the Southern Shore, it is a very fragmented region in what regards to energy and interconnections. Thirdly, in terms of net zero targets, we know that the EU aims to be neutral by 2050. And this is more than an aim. This is enshrined in EU law now, so it's a legal obligation for the EU to actually become net zero by 2050. Obviously, there are intermediate targets that need to be reached by 2030, and we usually refer to this decade as the critical decade, the make or break decade. But on the one hand, if on the Northern Shore we have these ambitious targets, it is important to highlight that there are no net zero targets in the Southern Neighbourhood. So that is a very critical difference as well in what regards to the diversity of our region. And we know that to reach net zero, this requires a transformational change at society level. Fourthly, in terms of energy transition in the region, we know that accelerating to meet the net zero target, we know that accelerating energy transition in the Mediterranean region is a key priority. We know as well that the Mediterranean basin is endowed with abundant energy resources, be it in terms of renewable energies, but also in terms of fossil fuels in some countries of the Southern Shore. But nevertheless, the region is energy deficient, meaning that energy security is a high priority, and the Mediterranean is a net importer, but it can become a net exporter if the energy transition policies are implemented, and namely the South Shore can actually be a major net exporter of energy. So this is also in this context that, as I mentioned, the ministers of the Union for the Mediterranean, so meaning the 42 ministers of the 42 countries of the Mediterranean, have gathered last year in Lisbon to to basically agree on a ministerial declaration that aims to foster a just and fair transition in the region, which I think it's quite an achievement, because it means that even though the Southern Shore countries might not have the same commitments in terms of EU legislation for net zero targets, there are still commitments, and there are still commitments being done. And we know that in terms of energy transition, the bulk of the effort will need to be in terms of energy efficiency, mostly in transport, buildings, agriculture, but also at industry level, which is very relevant. But also in terms of renewable energy and the decarbonization of the Mediterranean energy system. And finally, in terms of financing needs for the region, our UFM energy platforms estimate that for a carbon neutral future, cumulative investments of 6 trillion up to 2050 are needed overall in the Mediterranean region, which is 200 billion annual energy investment. This is huge. These are huge figures, but also taking into account that that the larger investment needs would be in the north, contrary to what people believe, because in the north we are already having the infrastructure, so we would need to readapt the infrastructure and technologies. And as I mentioned, like nearly 90% would be required for energy efficiency and the power sector, basically. So in terms of renewables and renewable power generation. And obviously, Mihai, please stop me if I'm running out of time. But basically, what I just wanted to say is that the magnitude of the effort needed to implement the Mediterranean, the energy transition in the Mediterranean, calls for substantial funding from both public and private investors, obviously. At the UFM, we regularly publish a report on climate finance flows in the Mediterranean, and we know that in terms of OECD commitments for the region, they reached in 2019 9.2 billion. To climate finance in the Southern Mediterranean region, not only speaking about the Southern Mediterranean region, and that development banks such as the IB, but also the EBRD, of course, and the World Bank have contributed 60% of these total commitments to the region. Then it's also worth noting the role of multilateral climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, like the CIF, which are important as source of concessional finance to basically triggering also the private sector investments. And in terms of main recipients in 2019, they were Turkey, Morocco, Egypt were the main recipients, also Jordan in the region. And in terms of sector, as mentioned, energy is by far the biggest sector in which these flows are being invested. And so let me stop here. I mean, as I mentioned, I think that to conclude, the Mediterranean is a climate hotspot, is an asymmetric region, and for sure is in need of dire climate finance to support the magnitude of the effort needed to implement the energy transition. But as mentioned, there are big challenges, but there are also clear opportunities for the southern shore of the Mediterranean. Thank you. I'll stop here. Thank you, Mihai. Back to you.
Thank you, Ines. This has been very, very helpful. You pointed out rightly, of course, the opportunities, also the challenges at the same time. It's just something that stuck to me was the 6.2 trillion you said until 2050, that you mentioned 200 billion per year. How are we gonna get this? Is there a plan to get this this funding, or where is it supposed to come from?
This is the funding from 2020 to 2050. Is the investment needs of the overall society needs for the energy transition. I mean, obviously, we are also comparing. I mean, in the course of 10 years, transport fleets are also being renewed and changed. So it's not that it's not that we are not comparing to to an alternative, whereas you wouldn't invest at all. But it's the bulk of the investment that it's needed overall in the South Shore and in the North Shore, as estimated by our energy platforms. Yes.
And I think, I mean, at least how it seems to me, to achieve this, you'll need, of course, all stakeholders to work together, right? The private sector, civil society, institutions.
Yes, of course, you need, and you need all the instruments. I mean, you need definitely the private sector, you also need the financial institutions to chip in, and some of the speakers also mentioned green bonds, for example, which is something that I haven't touched here, but it's very interesting to see that some of the countries of the Southern Shore, namely Morocco, but especially Egypt, are also advancing in that front. So given that there is a massive need of financing, we need to actually mobilize financing from all sources, and definitely. I mean, even though the public concessional finance is very important to unleash and to attract the private sector, the bulk of the investment will come from the private sector.
Thank you, Ines. This has been very, very helpful. I'll just move now also to Intissar to give us also a perspective from the countries, from the region, but also to have the United States angle, because also the US is involved at different levels here. Intissar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mihai. Thanks for having me. So it was a great opportunity for me to learn more on the technical end of things. And, you know, hearing about these plans, there's certainly no shortage of great ideas and intentions, but as always, it's really sort of the implementation where kind of plans meet reality on the grounds. And so to that end, I wanted to give a little bit of a view from the region on energy transition and cooperation, and pick up on some of the threads that my co-panelists have brought up. So North Africa, you know, when we're talking about climate action and mitigation specifically, we're talking about, you know, in part about energy transition and the role of renewable energy as an area of interest for governments and populations as much as it is for international partners. So looking at North Africa, you know, there is a disparity in terms of government plans, and this is something that Ines alluded to. Disparity in terms of government plans, infrastructure, and the impetus to deliver on climate pledges, and even to pursue bolder ones, especially as these countries all share similar geography, weather patterns, and, you know, the same potential for generating renewable energy to some extent. Here again, you know, Morocco is leading the way. Egypt is ramping up investment in the renewable sector, and Tunisia is also, you know, trying to make some substantial pledges to develop their renewable energy sector. Algeria, you know, lags, with Libya even still farther behind. So I want to focus on a couple of examples just to give a sense of how different the picture is and where some of the opportunities and greater collaboration might lie. So let me start with Morocco, which has drawn attention for its renewables, for its role in terms of renewable energy generation, putting in place ambitious infrastructure, regulatory framework, investment incentives for the renewable energy industry, particularly wind and solar here. This has helped the country diversify sources of energy. It's made it an attractive destination for foreign investment. Morocco put in place ambitious goals, as we've heard at the very beginning of the presentation. You know, it's I think the country is looking to make up over 52% of electricity generation from renewable sources by 2030. Right now, that percentage is at about 37%. There are, of course, two important incentives that are driving this. Morocco wants to lessen its reliance on costly fossil fuel energy imports and to position itself as a regional leader on climate change. One of the challenges that Morocco is facing, you know, according to the International Energy Agency, is really reducing the energy intensity of the country's economy. Some of the ways in which energy consumption can be reduced is to promote the use of renewables for residential energy and for transportation. In terms of public transportation, you know, I was in Casablanca and Rabat just a few weeks ago, And I was seeing electric buses were already being rolled out in addition to the tramway system that's been in place for a few years there. So, all of this just sort of more generally will require a substantial outlay of capital, as you and Ines were talking about early on. And so that's something, obviously that's a challenge for everybody, but that's certainly an area of where the EU could support further. And, one of the other challenges that's facing the renewable sector development, not just in Morocco, but overall, is that, their potential to create employment remains low. So that's also another issue for potential collaboration from the perspective of local economy and local sort of populations to address. Moving on, just to kind of look briefly at Tunisia and Algeria, neither have really developed as strong of a renewable energy sector for different reasons. Tunisia and Algeria both rely on gas for much of their electric generation. Gas makes up 96% of Algeria's electricity generation. Of course, Algeria is a major gas producer, and the importance of their production and export has only increased following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as Europe looks to limit its reliance on Russian gas. Algeria did not really prioritize its renewable energy industry, although that would have helped it offset domestic demand and free up gas for export. But that might be changing. I think that's, could be changing, moving forward. And I think, whenever gas and oil sort of fluctuates, it really drives home the importance of developing the renewables industry. The government has been putting in place plans to develop that industry for a while now, including recent measures to promote investment in renewables. So these are certainly positive steps that can be supported further by international partners. I think key challenge for Algeria here includes that the investment climate is still not all that attractive to foreign investors. There is more work to be done to improve also the doing business context for foreign companies. This is just on the business sort of side of things. The country has also undergone a major political transition that it's still sort of coming out of, and that will require at some point shifting or really rethinking its economic priorities, even though the country is right now generating substantial income from its gas exports at the moment. Tunisia, again, I think this was mentioned earlier, identified a goal of 30% of electricity generation from renewables by 2030. This is an extremely ambitious goal, given where the country is right now, and that they still need to establish stronger frameworks for planning, regulatory structures, and of course, again, financing on a large scale. The country is also facing a substantial economic crisis that saps investors' confidence in the country's future. The economic crisis is also worsened by President Qais Said's authoritarian turn, which is undoubtedly compounding already existing concerns about the country's viability as a destination for foreign investment. So just very briefly talk about, here, certainly Europe has been a major actor in this area, played an important role in helping these countries advance their renewable energy goal, not just so that these countries can better manage the budgetary pressures that they face for the fossil fuel importing countries to mitigate their own climate challenge threat, but also to help Europe meet its own energy transition goals. Morocco is ahead here of other countries in that regard, and the support that it receives from the EU reflects that, as we've heard throughout the presentation. One of the numbers that I have here, in 2018, Morocco was the second largest recipient of climate funding from the EU, I think totaling something like 429 million euros. And then very briefly, and I will close on this, the other side of climate action equation, efforts at adaptation. This is really where there is a lot of needs, as mentioned, in terms of government action. I think the story in North Africa reflects global efforts. Governments are trying to decrease existing vulnerabilities. For example, working with international partners on the agricultural sector, adopting more resilient crops. trying to improve irrigation mechanisms, making the most of growing seasons, alternative ways to access water through desalination plants, innovative projects even to trap moisture from clouds. This was something that was developed in Morocco a few years ago. These are areas where greater support can be provided. I would also add that civil society groups in these countries, especially in places where government action is slower, really play an important role, not just in terms of raising awareness, but also in terms of accountability, holding governments accountability, advocating and lobbying on behalf of vulnerable groups and environmentally threatened areas and populations. So, I would just close on that note as well, that civil society in this context could really benefit from greater support, access to technology, capital capacity building as well. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Intissar, for giving us the perspective from the local countries. You rightly mentioned a few concrete cases like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and this was a very good point on the needs of the civil society and how the EU can help them further. I would maybe have a question regarding how the EU is perceived in the region and how is the cooperation with the EU in the energy transition area is perceived.
I think it really depends on the countries. It depends on each country and the kind of sort of existing political climate there. I think in places like Morocco, where renewable energies are not just sort of, kind of something that Morocco does to generate support from the EU and to address its own needs, it's really becoming kind of a whole economic vision for the country. I think in terms of the population, there's a lot of pride in the role that Morocco has been able to play, and I think there is certainly a positive perception of the EU and the role that EU companies and EU institutions play in supporting that. I think there's also a lot of demand in terms of employment and employability that can be created in these sectors. I think the same thing I would argue in Tunisia as well. Of course, this is, as I mentioned, a much smaller sector, but there is certainly a lot of enthusiasm and hope about the potential that it can create. In Algeria, I think, to some extent as well, but, there's the country is not quite as open, I would say, to EU collaboration as its two neighbors, but I think there's certainly a lot of hope about developing renewable energies, more sustainable sort of environmental future for the country as well. So I think in terms of perception, this is an area where the EU has, good capital that it can build on moving forward.
Maybe just to follow up on this, because of course, when we look at the region, we can also say that the EU is not the only game in town, for instance. Sure. And there are other external actors that are present there, and I'm thinking, of course, China, the Gulf countries. Do you see an increased potential for competition in the energy transition area for the future?
Yeah, it's interesting because, when you look at China and the US, you mentioned the US, you asked me early on about the US, the whole topic of climate change is very politicized in the US. It's divisive. There's still not much consensus around the need to prioritize it. I'm talking in terms of the sort of, the kind of broader political landscape here. In terms of the EU's role, there was, of course, a major setback with the previous administration, which certainly, did not see climate change as a priority domestically, let alone abroad. So I think there is a lot of grounds to make up there for this administration in that regard. And I think this administration is definitely coming in, with the intention to sort of build that. As we saw in the first few weeks of the Biden administration, the president put forward an executive order to reestablish climate action as a US policy. So again, I think we're likely to see sort of more trickle down to various plans and strategies. There should be an Africa strategy that should be sort of coming through from the administration. that will be unveiled at some point, and I think there'll be, climate action will probably be an important pillar in that. But there is a lot to be done to ensure that the issue is central to U.S. foreign policy, and that policy is sort of designed around it rather than kind of having it fit into already existing agendas. But again, this is not just an issue for the U.S., it's a global issue. In terms of China, again, I think China is the highest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's also the largest producer of renewable energy technology, but it still relies on coal. China has in the past invested in coal plants, mining ventures, and also in renewable energy. But I think overall, China has built sort of a deep relationship with Africa that involves more cooperation on climate. And as we saw, I think it was the end of last year, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation in Dakar included a declaration on climate change cooperation that's supposed to focus more on green development, and including pledges not to invest in any new coal power production, and also potential for more climate finance. So I think this is sort of where China is heading. So, more competition, certainly that's one way to look at it. But it remains that in many places, Chinese investment in Africa still does not take into consideration local circumstances. They don't ensure that they are environmentally and socioeconomically sustainable. So that's something I think that African governments are going to kind of have to negotiate with China as they continue to build this partnership moving forward. And I can stop there.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. I think we have a very complete perspective now with the US and also China and other actors. And I would just, before moving to the Q&A, I would just maybe have a question for the whole panel to address, of course, in the room, which is the implications of the war in Ukraine on energy transition in the Mediterranean. Now, I'm looking also from a perspective from your organizations and institutions. And here, maybe I would go back to Director Rapaille to see what he thinks is the impact towards Mediterranean and what is the impact on, of course, IEB's work on the Mediterranean. So, Director Rapaille, if you can hear us, please, but very, very shortly, not a couple of minutes maximum, so that we hear from all the speakers, and then we also go into the Q&A.
Thank you. Well, clearly, I think we have to deal now with permanent crisis over the past 2 years. So with the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, on top of the climate threat, is that it has an impact on, let's say, the budgetary situation of the countries. I mean, we see great challenges with rising prices, which impacts both businesses and households. So there is a whole aspect around this. From an EU perspective, we see let's say, the importance to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and to engage in a decisive way in the green transition. And the other dimension is, of course, the funding aspect. Ukraine currently needs substantial financing support, and for the recovery and reconstruction will need hundreds of billions. So all this dimension is to be taken into account, looking at supporting the green transition in the Med region, because of, let's say, other potential priorities and budgetary constraints, and even potentially, let's say, diversion of priorities or funding. Now, clearly, this crisis, I mean, calls for, let's say, reinforcing the green transition. It's absolutely clear that we see that the dependence on fossil fuel, creates let's say, a massive impact. And it is important to have, let's say, coordinated support, coordinated funding to support the green transition, so that let's say we have a focused approach. But clearly, I'm not sure we are measuring yet fully the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine on the situation in the Mediterranean region.
Thank you. Those are some really good points. Stefano, any reaction from your side to the implications of the war in Ukraine on the green transition in the Mediterranean?
Well, in the first place, this crisis has only underlined the need for the green transition. We were already involved in greening our energy supplies and diversifying our fossil fuel supplies, in particular gas, and we're only accelerating, and we're only doing more than before. Now, there are two issues. One is the energy security for the EU, and one is the energy security of our partners. So, and they're not alternative, they're complementary. I mean, we can reinforce each other's energy security. What the partners will have to do is accelerate market integration. Well, same for the EU. We have to complete the interconnection of gas pipelines. We have to construct hydrolyzers. We have to in the EU we have to construct liquefiers for regasificators. I don't know the exact term in English. Anyway, to transfer an LNG back into gas and inject in the pipelines. We have to improve governance of the energy markets, in particular in the Southern Neighbourhood. Energy efficiency, because as Director Rapaille said before, energy demand in the countries, in the Southern Neighbourhoods, is growing, and it's growing irrespective of the crisis in Ukraine. So anyway, something had to be done. It only has to be done faster, with more constraints, and as much as possible in our interest with cooperating with the EU.
Thank you, Stefano. I'll just now quickly move to Ines for her perspective.
From our perspective, from my perspective in this case, I mean, I would like also to highlight that for the southern shore, there is not only the energy crisis that the war in Ukraine has triggered. There is also the price volatility of commodities, namely of wheat. That, for example, for a country like Egypt, it has a huge impact. And so we know that also that the region has some fragilities, and it is a region that has some aspects and some hotspots of also conflict, and so there is the risk that rising commodity prices, rising energy prices can trigger some conflicts and some tensions in the region. Obviously, on the bright side, as Stefano mentioned, there is the need for speeding up the transition, the need to accelerate the interconnections between the North Shore, the South Shore, so that the both markets are more interconnected, and there are more electricity exchanges between different markets, which is a huge difference between the North Shore, namely the EU, and the South. So yeah, I mean, as the other co-chairs have mentioned, there is definitely the energy security angle. There is also the energy affordability, but I think that the triggers that can be spurred also in terms of tensions in the region are also not neglectable from the region perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And now just to move to Intissar before we, and after we'll go to more questions from the audience. Intissar, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what my colleagues have said. I think it's interesting to kind of look at this in terms of sort of short-term, shocks and kind of long-term trends. We're looking at some of the sort of immediate challenges that both Ines and Director Rapaille mentioned. Food insecurity has been an issue coming, kind of going on for a while. We've got, budgetary pressures and such, but we also understand, as Director Stefano mentioned, that this all sort of underscores the importance of renewable energy and really building greater connections between these regions and sort of kind of south and north, but also there is really an opportunity for greater collaboration with other international actors, between the EU and the US in this regard, between sort of other actors that are trying to kind of take on their own kind of separate agenda in these different regions, to see what basis is there for collaboration and cooperation and pooling of resources.
Thank you. I think we have a complete picture from, of course, from different institutional perspectives, but also, the perspective regionally. And I think you all also mentioned at some point also like the impact for the countries in the region, like rising food prices, wheat prices as well. Now, I would just encourage the audience to use the Q&A function. We already have some questions here, and but I just to encourage you, if you have any questions, now it's a good time to pose them. I see we have around 10-15 minutes left in the discussion. Maybe there is a question from Maxime Sierra addressed to you, Ines. And it's a bit long, but I'm just going to go for it right now. So the Union for Mediterranean is a driver organization in the field of energy in the Mediterranean region. I would like to know more about interstate cooperation. How is the transition affecting international relations between the countries of the Union? And they're following up on this. Are there any subjects of friction that could impact a successful transition?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, let me say that the UFM is a platform for cooperation between the countries of the region. So it's an institution which mandate is basically to sit at the same table, the North Shore, the South Shore, on an equal footing. And it's one of the few places where, I'm going to be a bit controversial, but it's one of the few places where, for example, Palestine and Israel sit at the same table and discuss. So as other countries that might have tensions between them. That being said, what these discussions produce is documents like ministerial declarations, for example, or working platforms, for example, the platforms on energy that basically bring together experts at ministerial level from different countries to sit and discuss and to reach a common understanding and agree on common priorities. But obviously, we are not an implementing organization in the sense that we are not a bank. We are not financing concrete projects as the EIB has. We are also not an institution like the European Commission that is proposing, that is coming up with policy proposals or policy recommendations. So I do think that in terms of the international relations of this setting, in terms of energy matters, each region and each institution brings their own value added to the table. I think that for the Union for the Mediterranean, our value added is that we are an international organization that brings the North Shore and the South Shore on an equal footing, and I think that's something admirable and important. But obviously there are other actors and players in the field that will probably finance or build the transition. In this case, the energy transition in the region.
Thank you, Ines, for the answer. I see there's another question coming in just now from one of our colleagues. But before moving into that, I just wanted to make a quick foresight exercise. If we look, for instance, 10, 15, 20 years, into the future, I'm just curious to see how you view the scene of energy transition in the region, and what role will your organizations play. And I would maybe start with Director Rapaille here, and I would ask him what role, if we think of a possible future, 15, 20 years ahead, what role the IEB, could play, and how could the scene for energy transition in the Mediterranean look like, according to you?
Thank you for this question. I must really appreciate to think with a long-term approach, and actually it is our role in a way to foster long-term investment. Having said that, when we talk about climate transition, green transition, there is clearly an urgency to act now. And from this perspective, I think that all efforts needs to be put in place now to have this energy transition and to invest, let's say, across the board on the climate. From our perspective, I think, as I mentioned, we really have this ambition and requirement to significantly scale up our action. So our capacities enable us to invest much more in the, let's say, 5, 10 years, 15 years to come. Climate action calls for trillions of investments. So I think we have to be fully mobilized and to crowd in as much as possible private sector investment. So to answer your question, that's one first element, to be able to channel and leverage much more funding than what we can bring. Secondly, and it was mentioned by most of the co-panelists today, I think the regional integration, the interconnection with the EU will play a key role. And we know that these are long-term investments in place in just a matter of months or scaling up, crowding in much more financing, notably from the private sector, and aiming at further integration, investment in interconnection will really be what we expect to be doing in the years to come.
Thank you. Any other reactions from the panel? I'm looking at you, Stefano. Maybe you have a couple of thoughts on this.
I think your last question is very interesting, and I've been thinking about it. First of all, the Commission we think that the EU has a geopolitical role. As I said, we intend to lead on the green transition, which is a global objective. And this is why we've put in place the Green Deal, which serves to demonstrate that you can decouple growth and damages to the planet. We want to push for green growth. The tools that we have for this is we have a role of, again, a diplomatic role, a global diplomatic role. We have a role of regulator of the EU market. We can propose regulatory examples that can work for third countries, and we hope in particular for the Mediterranean region. We manage public funds. Public funds are very important to implement policies. And for this, we have the grants, we have the European Fund for Sustainable Development, so a guarantee scheme which serves to leverage immense amounts of funding. So briefly, political and implementing, I see a political and implementing role for the EU and for the Commission in particular.
Thank you. Ines, any thoughts from your side?
If I think of medium long-term goals for the region, I would like to see the Southern Shore countries also coming forward with concrete net zero targets. This might be quite ambitious, and and maybe a bit unfair, because it's true that they have contributed less to the problem, but this is a common problem, so it needs a common solution. So I think that we are seeing some mobilization from some countries, but it's not across the board yet. So I would think that would be something that I would expect to see in the coming decade.
Now, just to move on for some last thoughts from you, Intissar.
Sure. I think maybe I'll take kind of the framing that you gave in your last position, in your last question, to use as sort of a way to conclude, my intervention. I think, looking out 20 years, we sort of already know what these, in terms of energy transition, we already know what these countries' goals are, right? They each have identified, at least in terms of electricity usage and renewable energy, they've each identified their own targets in terms of reducing emissions. Some targets are more ambitious than others. So we kind of have a little bit of maybe a best case scenario vision of where things would be, assuming that all the stars align and that all the funding comes through and that all the information happens. And so I think maybe another good exercise to sort of undertake is to think about what can stand in the way of them reaching these targets. And certainly, we've talked about funding, we've talked about, the kind of geopolitical landscape and some of the challenges there. But I also think there is a common and sort of, unexciting issue that really is at the heart of a lot of these implementation challenges, which is just really better governance practices. A lot of these countries need to work on their, they need to work on their, governance problems not just in terms of, climate challenges and climate issues, but really just across the board. And I think this is an area where EU support, working with international partners, and really just sort of mustering and coming up with the political will to do this is going to be very important. This is not just about international partnerships. This is also about populations, wanting to have, better lives, wanting to hold their governments accountable. And I think this is something that is really at the heart of all of these aspirations that will continue to be important, and where action, both domestic and international, needs to continue to come through.
Thank you for this. Now I'm just moving back to the Q&A, and we have a question from our colleague at APC, Rita, who asks, to what extent are the countries in the Southern Neighbourhood dependent on investments from the private sector to pursue their renewable energy goals? I mean, this question is up for grabs, so I don't know who would like to jump in on it.
I can say a few words, Mihai. I think, as mentioned before, given the magnitude of investment which are needed, it can, of course, not all be supported by public sector or by budgetary resources, be it from the countries themselves or international partners. So private sector needs to come in with financing. Now, renewable energy, with the right framework, with the right regulatory environment, can attract private sector investment. So I see it's not so much of a dependency, but more as an opportunity to channel private sector funding. Now, clearly, it works very well in some areas. And I think when we talk about, for instance, wind energy or solar, the cost of, let's say, this energy, the economics may soon move to hydrogen, for instance. Well, here we will need bankable for private sector to be rolled out. We will need to put in private sector coming in to have, let's say, large and high level of investment in these areas.
Can I compliment Mihai? Thank you. Well, the private sector, as Director Rapaille said, the private sector will have to intervene because public money will certainly not be enough. But indeed, there are great opportunities for investments. In the sector of renewables, of course, because the energy that you sell, even produced from renewables, is energy, and there's a market for energy demand. But there's also a big market on energy efficiency, where energy savings can be extremely rewarding. And this is why schemes have been put in place with third-party investors, ESCOs, etc. And then the private sector is also extremely present in the development of the hydrogen sector. It's something that we think is going to be driven mostly by the private sector. Of course, an important role for public sector in terms of regulation, addressing, etc. But again, the bulk of the investments will be done by private companies.
Thank you for the answers. Now, if there is no one else to complement on this this question, there is another question, but for Intissar, but I think she already touched upon it in her presentation. So basically, if I understand correctly, the question is, what can we do more to mobilize the population in the Southern Neighborhood countries to drive policy and regulatory change to facilitate the green transition, for instance, in Egypt? But I think you already touched upon that a little bit when you mentioned the role of civil society, if I'm not mistaken, that they play an important role in accountability and also in raising awareness. So I don't know if there is anything else you'd like to add to this. Otherwise, I would just move to the closing remarks.
We can move to the closing.
Now I'm mindful of the time, and I see you have just a couple of minutes left. So I'm just maybe go back to the panel in a reverse order, just to see a final remark, something very important that we should keep in mind while moving forward. Just one thing that you think it's the most relevant when moving forward. And in reverse order, we'll start with you, Intissar, and then go to Ines, Stefano, and end with Director Rapaille.
Sure. I mean, I already mentioned that in my previous point. I think we, again, we'll have to come back to the whole idea of, governance and helping these governments improve governance standards and practices so that they can meet their goals and that they can meet their population's aspirations. I think that is an important, that's an important point that needs to always be sort of present, and we need to kind of be mindful of it as we look at these bigger and loftier plans.
Now going to you, Ines.
From my side, I mean, if I would, in a nutshell, I would say that what's at stake now, it's the time for implementation, and this is indeed the critical decade, the time for action. So that's what I would like to put the emphasis on. Thank you.
And now we're going to Stefano.
Yeah, for me, if you want to forget everything we said now, but remember one thing is that there is no alternative to growth which is sustainable, and that the present geopolitical situation only confirms that we must move towards more resilient energy systems and more sustainable economies and energy sources, and the involvement of all the partners on a global scale is essential for this.
And now going to Director Rapaille for the final remarks.
Thank you, Mihai. Well, from my perspective, I think, and it was said by the colleagues, the importance to move from commitments, declarations to implementation of tangible investments. It's certainly critical. And second, to have a holistic approach on the green transition in various sectors, various areas which are all intertwined, and to have a green transition and raise it put in place.
Thank you. I think the connection was a little bit broken, but we could pick up some of the pieces. But if there is nothing else to add, I'll just maybe thank you all for the contribution today. I think it was a very insightful discussion. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. And I'm looking forward to other events that EPC will do, focused on the Mediterranean and these new, emerging topics such as energy transition, food security, water security, and so on and so forth. And with this, I will close the discussion, and thank you once again to the IEB and to all the speakers for participating. Thank you.